Hello, everyone. This is Pastor Alan Hathaway. I am sharing with you this particular message. It's called Standing on the Edge of the Field. I will not be sharing this message in Garrison today because I have special events going on in Riverdale at the Riverdale Community Church beginning at 8:30 this morning. But I'm privileged to have Pastor Mike Seiler with us in Garrison, and he'll be sharing for our morning service there, and I'm excited about that. I wish I were going to be there to hear him speak. There are a lot of things that I think about when I think about standing on the edge of the field. One of the things that I remember just a few years ago was with my wife, Terry. We were out in western North Dakota, not far from Dickinson. And we were on a hilltop watching, looking particularly at a sculpture that was out in the field, a steel sculpture. It's along the Enchanted Highway. And as we looked out across the distance, we were watching the grain, and it was almost ready for harvest. And it undulated like waves of the sea as the wind rippled through it. I thought about how promising that is, that moment before harvest. But I also have lived in the Dakotas long enough to know that there is that time that has to come before the harvest. The time of sowing, the time of spring's work, the effort and the labor that goes into that. And it has always been that way in the culture of farming. It's always been a process of getting ready to plant and planting and taking care of the land and cultivating. And then there comes that moment of harvest when everything is ready and you are excited as you step into the field and begin the process of harvest. But as you wait on the edge of the field, waiting for the moment to plant, and this year has been kind of difficult because of the drought, knowing when and how and what to plant, and even if you need to plant. So those are all some struggles that people in the agricultural business are struggling with. But there is a truth that if you never plant, you never harvest. And that is something that the writer Solomon talks about in Ecclesiastes, and he also talks about in Proverbs. The person who is always wondering about whether they should plant or whether they should prepare for the harvest will never actually do it. And that's part of our struggle as Christians. When is the right time? When is the right moment to begin the process? I struggled with a lot of things as I was thinking of this particular message this Sunday. I was struggling with a lot of the areas that we struggle with. The passage here comes from Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10 is an interesting passage for me because in this particular passage it comes late, and at least in my opinion, comes late in the ministry of Jesus. It is a time when he is consolidating his ministry here, and he sends his disciples out for one last missionary journey. Now, he sent the first missionary journey, he sent out the 12 at first, and he sent them primarily into the area of Galilee, but here it seems to be a broader ministry that goes in many different directions. Here in Luke chapter 10, it takes in account of 70 or 72, and there's some discussion as to whether it should be translated as 70 or 72. Nevertheless, it is a larger number of people that he has sent out. Just before he sends out his 12, he gives to them the admonition that they are to look at the harvest, for the laborers are few, and pray that the Lord of the harvest, or the master of the harvest, will send out more laborers. But here, actually, he reverses the order of that admonition And in Luke chapter 10, he gives it after he has commissioned the 70 to go out. I wondered about that kind of change in the structure. And it seems to reflect the sense that the 12 were the preparatory. They were the beginning ones. They were the ones who were out there plowing. They were the ones who were out there seeding and preparing the ground for the harvest. The 70 he sends out now are those who are going out with the sense of harvesting what has been planted. It is now come to fruition. Jesus would use this same analogy on another occasion. He would use it in the Gospel of John as he has just finished speaking to the Samaritan woman. His disciples come back and he basically says to them, "Look to the fields, for they are white." And you say 4 months to the harvest. But I tell you right now, the harvest is upon you. It is a harvest which you have not labored for, which another has labored. The indication is that the Samaritan woman has planted the seeds already in the city. And it is time for the disciples to go with him into the city and begin harvesting the souls. Very often we live in our own generation. We think we're the one generation who has experienced these difficulties or these tremendous events. But in truth, those things have happened in many generations. I was thinking about some of the struggles we've had with questions about morality and ethics in this particular generation. And I thought about the fact that this isn't the first time that these kinds of struggles have gone on in our culture. If you go back to the 1920s, they were called the Roaring Twenties for a reason in American history. There was a lot of sexual license during that particular time, a lot of criminal activity, a lot of things that were happening that should not have been happening. In fact, very often criminals were heralded as Robin Hoods in their culture because there was a lot of mistrust of the government. And then in 1915, the Ku Klux Klan came back into existence with all of its evils. And they began the process of working their way through society. And by the 1920s, they were in positions of power. Many of them had been elected to high office secretly, not revealing their connections. Also, many of them were in positions where they were wealthy and intellectual and powerful, and many of our major institutions in this country had involvement with the KKK. And it is frightening when you realize the impact and the infiltration of our culture that they had in the 1920s. It created a lot of the serious problems that we struggled with as a nation. I thought about that and the fact that the intellectual class of the 1920s had basically given up on God, and the entertainment class had given up on the concept of God, and they had moved completely away from that conception. It had been a long process that had began in the latter part of the 1800s, actually 1870s it had begun, and it grew and developed during that particular time. As Christians, we sometimes think that this is the only time when things have been bad. But on the brink of the Great Depression, things were really bad, morally, ethically, and spiritually in this nation. It would take a Great Depression, a Second World War, to change things. But in the 1950s would come one of the greatest revival movements in modern history. It would be transformative to our culture. We sometimes think that God's word is silent, but it is not. These kinds of events have taken place throughout history, and until Christ returns, they will continue to take place. What God calls us to do is to be faithful in our process of preparation. We are called to plow. We are called to seed. Paul says to the Corinthians, I have prepared the soil. I have seeded the soil. Apollos has come along and watered the seed. But it is God that gives the increase. What he calls us to be is faithful in this generation. I believe we stand at the edge of the field. God is calling us in to begin the work of plowing and seeding so that he can bring about another great harvest. Whether it is a harvest of a revival or whether it is the harvest of the end times, whatever it is, it will be God's harvest. And we are called to plow and to seed and to water and watch the increase and rejoice in God's harvest. God has called you to that today and called me to that. I hope that you will serve him and honor him today. I'd like to invite you to come and be a part of our services today. Remember, our service in Riverdale at the community church begins at 8:30, and our service in Garrison begins at the Church of God at 10:30. And we have special guest speaker, Pastor Mike Seiler, sharing with us. I know you'll enjoy these events. I hope you come and share the day with us in one or two or both of these locations. I want to pray that God blesses you today in everything. Take care. We'll see you next time.